Figure out where your natural inclinations lie, figure out where your natural talents lie, and then use those to be consistent. Because once you've got consistency down pat, once you make consistency as effortless for you as possible, everything else will fall into place. Because you cannot achieve consistency unless you enjoy something. You cannot get to consistency unless you're playing to your strengths. You cannot force yourself to be consistent. I wouldn't be able to worry about how many listeners I'm getting on the audio versus visual if I wasn't making the podcast in the first place. I wouldn't be able to worry about the design of my Instagram posts and the design of the intros and outros of my episodes if I wasn't being consistent in the first place. So I think that once you pair the thing that you're naturally talented with your natural inclinations or your natural personality, then you end up in the perfect moment. Camera is rolling, and welcome back to episode 27 of the podcast. I'll tell you what, we are cooking with gas now. We are really moving. We are really moving. I've been so fired up the last few weeks to record this podcast. I don't know what happened in the teens. Between episode 11 and 18, I didn't not want to do it, but I was catching a little bit of a down spell. And I'm sure that a little bit of that was due to the fact that we were in full-scale lockdown, or being put back into full-scale lockdown, and I was a little unmotivated and feeling a little sorry for myself and all that sort of stuff. But I'll tell you what, the last few episodes, I have been so fired up, and I hope that it's translating to you guys. I hope that it's coming across in the way that I'm speaking. The length of the episodes too, we've stretched the last few episodes well out past an hour, which has been awesome to see. I want to give you guys as much content as possible because, from my own experience listening to podcasts, I've said this before and I'll say it again, but I find that I listen to podcasts for the entertainment value as much as I do the educational aspect of it. That's why I listen to a lot of comedians. I actually find that I don't listen to any podcasts, maybe with the exception of when one of my creative friends goes on to someone else's podcast, but there is not really any creative podcasts. And when I say creative, I mean people in my creative industry, not creative in general. All podcasts are by their very nature creative, but I don't really listen to many creative podcasts. At the moment, I've sort of been listening to TMG, Friendly Geordies, Luke and Lewis, Lewis Spears' individual podcast, so Spearhead Sundays, and that's about it. Sunday Sauce by Philion and Original 151, if any of you guys know that one. And I find that the thing that I like about those podcasts is that because they know, they're self-aware enough to know that they're entertaining, not educating. And I'm sure there's educational elements to it, but part of the aspect of why I enjoy listening to their podcast is it's part of my weekly routine. It's part of what I do on those specific days where their podcasts come out. Monday morning, for example, is a great training day for me because I have plenty of podcasts to listen to whilst I'm training. And I know that each of those podcasts is going to be a certain length. So for me, providing you guys with podcasts that are between that 45-minute to an hour mark is super, super important for me, just as much as the content itself in the podcast. And I think that that's kind of a cool thing that I've been able to do the last few weeks is I've been able to just sit here and talk and feel like I'm not just rambling as well. I've been stoked and I've been fired up to make them. The topics that I've wanted to talk about have really, really interested me. I've finished each of the podcasts and gone, that may not have been cohesive. I don't know if it's going to sound any good, but I'm at least happy that I touched on the points that I did. So I hope that that's translating through to you guys. The other thing I want to quickly say before I get into this week is thank you so much. The amount of messages I got this week from you guys is flat out unbelievable. And the views, again, are up this week. So thank you so much to each of you who listened to my call to action at the start of last week's podcast and shared it with a friend. I actually got messaged by a few people telling me that their friends had recommended the podcast. So thank you so much for those of you that did that. I really do appreciate it. And it does help me out a lot. So hopefully this is me explaining that what you have done throughout this week has actually helped me a lot, or throughout the last few weeks. We've grown by pretty much a third week over week for the last few weeks, and it's been awesome to see because, you know, this podcast is a hobby. It's something that I do on my personal time. I don't make any money from it, obviously. You know, there's no ads or anything on any of these, but hopefully you guys can tell that I'm passionate about this, and I am actually going to speak about this today, not specifically podcast, but the whole thing of passion and all that sort of jazz. How's everyone's week been this week? I've had a little bit of an interesting week. I'm excited this week because I get to go back to work, like my transactional element of my work. I get to go back to freelancing this week, which is going to be awesome. I've got 2 shoots already planned, which I'm super excited about. I've got some stuff going on in the background that's going to help me longer term, which I'm super excited about. A lot of business stuff going down at the moment, which I could announce for you guys, but it's not really relevant to what you guys will see. This is the stuff that helps me support this stuff. So there's developments with my wedding videography business that's going on at the moment. I'm sort of branching that out into its own standalone brand that I want to scale and turn into something in the future, because I think there is, I'm passionate. I enjoy shooting weddings, and I think that there's a lot of people that get into shooting weddings because it's lucrative. But I've found more and more, and I did originally get into shooting weddings because it's a really good opportunity to learn and a really good opportunity to make some money. But the more I shoot them, the more I realize that I'm really passionate about it. And even if I'm not going to be the one actually shooting the weddings for the business, eventually down the line, I obviously want to, slowly become the owner and step away from actually doing the day-to-day of the business. But even if I'm not the one shooting it, I'm passionate enough about it that I want to have an impact on that space. So I'm doing some stuff at the moment to create a bit more of a brand behind my wedding work, which will be fun. I'm sort of separating my videography production company from my own name, which is fun as well. It's cool to sort of step into that business owner realm rather than purely creating, because up until now, obviously I've worked with editors and I've hired people and I've done all this sort of stuff separate from my personal brand here on social media, but it is still under the name Tom Noski. So there is a part of me that when I show up to set, I'm showing up as me. I'm not showing up as my brand, and that sort of makes it difficult to scale. So there's some stuff going on in the background right now, which is fun and exciting, but a little bit boring if you're a follower of me from Instagram or YouTube. It's not really relevant to any of that sort of stuff, but good for you guys to know. Good for you to know that there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that allows me to do things like this and not have it monetized immediately. There's a lot of work that goes into supporting myself financially with other means so that I have the means to do this sort of stuff. It's not sort of a, I don't want any of you under the illusion that I'm supporting myself fully financially from Instagram, YouTube, and podcasts, because that is not the case at all. I'm sure there's, and I'm not going to throw anyone under the bus, but I'm sure there's plenty of people out there that kind of want to give off that image, and it's not actually the case. I actually want the opposite. I want you guys to be fully aware of the fact that that is not the case with me. It's something I would like to do in the future, and I'll make it I'll be sure to let you guys know when that transformation happens and I eventually start going into making a little bit of money with the podcast and YouTube and Instagram and all that sort of stuff. But at the moment, it's just a hobby. It's just my side hustle. It's what I do on the side. I make a little bit of money from it, but it's nothing substantial. It's not, not enough to support myself financially on. So that's been going down this week. Restrictions have eased a little bit as of about half an hour ago here in Melbourne, which is such a massive weight off my shoulders. Because obviously, as I've spoken about, the last few weeks have been better, but there were a few weeks back there where I was just in a bad headspace. Not, I wasn't sad or anything like that, but it was just so difficult for me to be creative. I was finding it really difficult to motivate myself and get myself moving and be productive and be creative. I was finding it really, really difficult. So to have restrictions ease a little bit feels amazing. It really, really does. No more curfew. We've got lesser restrictions on what businesses can function, which is why I'm able to go back to work next week. Just a few small changes, nothing crazy. I still can't see my friends, which sucks. I still can't travel to areas within Victoria, which sucks. I still can't go outside of my 5 kilometer radius, which sucks, but You know, I'm no longer on house arrest from from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. or from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. every single night, which is nice. That won't make much of a difference. It's not like I'm going out of my house at after 9 p.m. much or before 5 a.m., but it's nice to know that I can. I was super excited about the possibility of, let's be perfectly honest, the only reason I don't want to be in lockdown right now is because I want to get tattooed again, and I was kind of half hopeful that today they were going to announce that beauty and self-care and all that sort of stuff was going to go back to work, which means that I can go and get more tattoos because I have a bunch of sketches and stuff planned for my legs and for my torso and all that sort of jazz. And no, I've got to wait another 3 or 4 weeks before that'll happen. So that's disappointing, but kind of expected. This week, I've got to be honest with you guys, I wish I could give you an update on book club, but I don't have one. I had a super inconsistent week of reading this week. I don't know. I think I got stuck on a book and I was determined to finish it before I moved on because I knew if I put the book down, I wasn't going to finish it. I'd completely sort of lost interest, not lost interest on the topic, but kind of I felt like the book kind of dragged on. And I'd gotten what I wanted to achieve out of the book. The book is Hold Me Tight. And I'm enjoying it. I've only got like a chapter and a half to go, but I'm just really procrastinating on finishing that book. And it's meant that I haven't been as consistent every single day in my hour before bed getting into reading because I'm not as interested in the topic that I'm reading. And I'm determined to finish it before I move on. And I'm caught in this cycle of I want to read, but I don't want to read. And I want to read a new book, but I can't read a new book until... Anyway, I'm this week going to put that book down or at least try and finish it this week, but also simultaneously, if I don't want to read that book, I'm not going to read it. I'm going to read something else because the habit of reading, as much as I am... And I think I'm going to make a YouTube video about this because as much as I am aware that my reading isn't necessarily for the enjoyment... And let me explain this for a second. My reading is... I don't read because I enjoy reading. I do enjoy the benefits that I get from reading. I enjoy the fact that I'm expanding my knowledge. I enjoy the fact that I feel like I'm working out my brain. Like, you know, I love fitness and I love working on my body and I love training and I love all that sort of stuff. So doing it has almost become the same passion that I have for my physical health. I now have for my constant education is probably or my brain, my intelligence is the best way to describe it. It's that same passion. I don't necessarily enjoy, like this morning, I went for a 10K run and I did a bodyweight workout. I don't necessarily wake up on a Sunday morning and go, I really want to do a 10-kilometer run and a bodyweight workout. But I'm passionate enough about it and I enjoy the results that I get from it. Reading's kind of a similar thing. I don't enjoy reading. I don't enjoy the act of reading. I don't find it relaxes me, but I don't find it that, you know, I'm not foaming at the mouth to start reading every single day. And I think that that's a misconception a lot of people get into, especially with a lot of things. Like fitness, for example, is a big one. I found with a lot of my clients, they would be waiting for that moment where they were going to fall in love with it rather than waiting for the moment where they're going to fall in love with the person that activity makes them. Does that make sense? I think a lot of people listening to this would find a lot of clarity in that differentiation between enjoying the activity and enjoying the person you become from doing that activity. Fitness is a really easy example to try because I don't think anyone enjoys, and if they do, they're lying to you or they haven't really figured out this differentiation between enjoying the activity and enjoying the person you become from the activity. But reading's a similar one. I enjoy the fact that I feel knowledgeable or I feel more knowledgeable or I'm expanding my knowledge every single time I read. I don't enjoy the act of reading. But this week has been a good indication that I need to sort of leverage that a little bit more and know that if I fall out of love with a book, I'm not reading for the fact that I have finished a certain amount of books cover to cover. I'm reading for the benefit that I gain from a book. So if I get halfway through a book and I feel like I've gained something from it and I'm no longer enjoying it, there's no reason why I need to finish it. I should just take out the bookmark, put it back on the shelf, and hopefully come do it again in the future. But, you know, there's that competitive side of me that's like, no, I've got to make sure I finish it. I've got to make sure I do it. But yeah, this week has been inconsistent with my reading. So I'm sorry about that as far as my book club listeners, that I can't give you guys an update on that today. But, hopefully, well, not hopefully, I need to stop saying hopefully. This week will be better, and I'll make sure I get plenty of reading done this week, and I can give you guys an update on that next week. Training was super consistent this week, so, downside is I had a bad week of reading, had an amazing week of training. I'm feeling a little burnt out though, so I think I'm going to take a little bit of time off. Not time off training, but like lessen the load of training a little bit. Maybe drop my distances a little bit, because I've had, I think, like 4 or 5 or 6 weeks now of really consistently hitting my mileage every single week. And although I feel amazing for that, and although I feel motivated from that, obviously that comes with the inevitable point where your body is going to start going, Tom, this sucks. I'm really tired. So I think I'm going to have a little bit of a rest week. For those of you who are at all curious about my Ironman training, which, who knows, maybe it's a few of you, maybe it's not. Today I wanted to talk about a topic that has been on my mind a lot recently. I've sort of, especially between this podcast and my YouTube channel. If any of you, obviously I've spoken about this on here before, and I've spoken about this a lot actually lately, because it has been something I've been deliberating over, or it's been weighing heavy on my mind, is the fact that why do I find it so easy to be consistent on here, and I find it so difficult to be consistent on something like YouTube and even Instagram to a certain extent? Why am I able to get on here like clockwork once a week? I'm sorry, I'm moving for my YouTube viewers. You're probably wondering, Tom, what is he doing? I'm just feeling fidgety. I was feeling amped up to record this week, and I'm sitting here and I'm sort of finding my bearing and whatever. So sorry if you're watching on YouTube and you see me bloody shifting around in my seat. I'm just being fidgety. But yeah, I've been deliberating over this a lot recently, is the fact that why am I so consistent? Why can I get on here and work like clockwork? Why do I enjoy this so much more? Why do I find it effortless to get on here and record a podcast, but why do I find it so difficult? And not even difficult. Difficult's not a good word, because I don't find it that difficult to make a video. But why do I feel so much creative resistance, is probably a good word from any of you who did go on to read The War of Art. Why am I finding so much creative resistance? And I'm caught between the mentality of, again, for those of you who have read it, I'm caught between the idea that I'm finding a lot of resistance because it's important to me, but then that also doesn't explain this. And there is also the mentality as well. It's like I've brought this up. I'm sort of in a bunch of different minds with this. I obviously have a lot of momentum behind me with this podcast. But that still doesn't give me an answer as to why I've not been able to build enough momentum to keep me going on YouTube. Why is this still more effortless than, say, my YouTube channel is? And the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is because the topic that I wanted to talk about, or at least the explanation I've been able to find for myself, and the explanation that I've heard from other creative friends, is working to your strengths and remembering the reason why you do something. I was listening to a podcast, I think it's Chase Tuning or Everforward Radio. Yeah, Everforward Radio with Chase Tuning. And he was interviewing his brother Max. And I was listening to the podcast because Max is, yes, he's in a completely different industry. He does fitness-related content. But he is probably... yeah, he's probably the first person that I ever subscribed to on YouTube. And when I say subscribed, I mean the first person that I actually followed with any sort of enthusiasm. Obviously, I'd consumed YouTube content before that. I'd consumed a lot of fitness-related YouTube content before that. This was back in, say, 2013, I think it was, or 2012, 2013, when I was maybe 15, 16, and early days of me getting into fitness. Max was one of the first personalities that I followed with any sort of enthusiasm. And he was talking about the fact that you need to create in the form that is most connected or the most relevant to your personality is probably the easiest way to describe it. And he described it in the sense of finding your why, or remembering your why, or understanding, that he creates in his style because it's most connected to his why. But I really resonated with it in the sense of it showed me that you need to work to your strengths that you already have. You need to find a way to create in a way that connects most easily to the strengths that you're already given as a person. Not just as a creative, not just as a personality, not just as your style or whatever it is. I mean pure personality. What is it that, or what medium or what format or what way can you create or do something that works with those strengths? Now, I'm talking in the sense of being a creator today, but this is definitely something that I think can be translated into any career. It can be translated into being an athlete. It can be translated into being a professional. It can be translated into just about anything, especially for a lot of my younger viewers. If you're, in high school and you're getting to the point where you've sort of got to figure out what you want to do, or even if you're a little bit older, if you're my age and you're still figuring out what you want to do, I think one of the things that is not encouraged enough, especially in my experience with high school, is to figure out what you are predisposed to do. What talents do you already have? What do you find the most comfort in? And the general theme of the reason why I wanted to speak about this is the idea of working to your strengths. Because I think a lot of artists, especially, and again, I'm talking to artists, but this is definitely something that I think can be translated to any career, is a lot of artists get trapped chasing after a format or medium that's desirable or lucrative. Something like YouTube is extremely desirable right now. It's extremely desirable to be a YouTuber, because if you can be good at YouTube, if you're the kind of person that is good on video, charismatic and entertaining, it can be extremely lucrative for you, and it becomes extremely desirable because these people lead incredible lives. And yes, I'm under no illusion that they work extraordinarily hard. I know how difficult that lifestyle must be. But what I'm saying is that you have to be that type of person that carries those strengths initially to have enough consistency, or have the ability to be consistent for long enough that you become successful and that career becomes lucrative. And I think that right now, with the renaissance that we're going through with creativity these days, with all these platforms that are allowing people to be successful and be extremely successful. I said this in, I think, the last podcast, or I've said this a few times. It's like there has never been a time in human history where it's been as easy to be a full-time artist. There's never been a time in history where it has been as accessible to make a really, really, really good living as a creative entrepreneur. There has never, ever been a time in human history. So with that comes the fact that it still requires all the same things to be successful, but it's far more obvious. The successes are far more clear. There's far more routes that you can go, and there's obvious examples of paths. Whereas before, it was kind of like, I'm a creative person, I'm just going to create what I enjoy most, and hopefully that carries me through. It's like, I'm not saying that the old days were better. Not at all. I think that this is a much better time, but I think that the path isn't as easy, or isn't as basic in the sense. Because now, if you're a photographer, you can do YouTube, you can do TikTok, you can do Instagram, you can do online, you can do a podcast, you can do blogging, you can do just about anything. And then that's not even to talk about all the different types of freelancer you could be, or you could do freelancing or your own stuff. You could do a whole different bunch of things. Whereas before it was just, I'm a photographer, I enjoy photography, I'm going to do photography. And yes, you could do it in a different sense. You could be a sports photographer and all that sort of stuff. But I think now you're drawn in so many different directions, because someone can be a photographer, but they can also be great on video and super charismatic. And that's how you end up with someone like a Peter McKinnon. Not every photographer is destined to be a Peter McKinnon and to be fantastic on video. That's not the case at all. But I think that that's what I mean by a lot of artists these days get trapped chasing after something that's lucrative or something that becomes desirable. I'm not discouraging you to not give it a shot, because I think you can definitely get better over time. And that's something that I want to make a little bit of shed a little bit of clarity on, is I'm not trying to tell you that you should not try, because if I think back to my first videos, if I think back to my first photos, if I'd have judged it from that, especially with the video side of things, especially with what I'm doing right now, I don't think I could. I'm about to go into detail as far as, whether YouTube is the right thing for me, but I don't think I could be doing this, which I do think is the right thing for me, unless I did YouTube first. Does that make sense? It's like, I don't think I could have discovered the path that I needed to be on until I gave it a shot. So I still think you need to give it a shot. But what I'm trying to tell you is that if you're the type of person that naturally finds that you're the funny guy in the room, you're the person who's always chirpy and quick-witted and makes everyone laugh, and you're charismatic and you're comfortable in yourself and you're happy to make a fool of yourself, then you're probably going to be bloody good on camera. But if you're really, really shy, and there is the irony of this, that most YouTubers are self-proclaimed introverts who find it easier to talk on camera than they do to other people. But I think that there is some common sense to be drawn in here of what type of creative does your personality lend itself to be? Does that make sense? I'm trying to build the foundation of my argument for this entire podcast, and I hope it's making at least a little bit of sense. For me, for example, I think this is the easiest way to make sense of what I'm trying to say here. Is that I think me, for example, like if I was to describe my personality prior to any of this, with excluding the personality that I've built through doing this stuff, because I think that's the other thing as well. I think that I've definitely become a more confident person since doing something like YouTube and this podcast. I've definitely become a better conversationalist since doing this YouTube and this podcast. I feel like I'm more charismatic in public than I was before, and that's probably this common thread between creatives, is that they are introverts. They learn to be, or learn the benefits of being an extrovert. And I've described myself a lot as that to my friends. They say that I'm an introvert who knows the benefits of being an extrovert. I know that there are definitely social and economic benefits to being a little bit more extroverted, but I am definitely at my core an introvert. I'm a collected guy, and I enjoy having deep conversations. I'm the kind of guy who, if you put me at a party, I'm probably not going to be dancing. I'm probably not going to be, I might get a little bit shit-faced, but that's because I like having a beer. But I'm probably going to be the person who picks someone that I think is interesting and having a conversation with them. I'm going to be having a deep conversation. I'm going to be asking lots of questions. I'm a curious person. I enjoy having serious conversations. I enjoy getting into the weeds with someone. That's what I enjoy doing. Now, me making, short form comedy sketches on TikTok is never going to happen. No matter how hard I try, that's never, ever going to happen for me. There's no part of my being that sits and goes, yeah, my personality lends itself well to TikTok. I see the benefit of it. I see the benefit of me jumping on TikTok. It's very desirable for me to jump on TikTok. I have friends who had tried to build a career on YouTube and Instagram, two platforms that I find very, very desirable and at least lend themselves well enough to my personality. I have friends who had tried for years to build a career on there, jumped to TikTok, built an audience in a very short period of time because they were those loud, excitable kind of people, and have now leveraged that new audience to build their careers or jumpstart their careers on YouTube and Instagram. So they have now done TikTok, and that has led them to having a career on YouTube and Instagram. And they've essentially done something that I would look from the outside looking in as very desirable and very attuned with my career path, or what I want my career path to be. But I still recognize that for me to do what they did, I would have to work twice as hard because my personality doesn't lend itself to that style of creating. And I wouldn't be able to focus on things like getting better because I'd be so focused on forcing myself into being the type of person that can create content on that platform. I've tried TikTok. I've tried that. And it just didn't work for my personality. And I've got a lot of people I know who are in the same boat. They've tried things and they've discovered that it's not going to work for their personality. You know, it would be impossible for me to keep up with someone who is very fast-paced, is very witty, finds, is the funny guy, is the funny guy, is the person that is, the light of the room. It would be impossible for me to keep up with someone like that on these platforms. And I'm not trying to say that that's good enough reason not to try, because it's still worth trying. It's still worth discovering if maybe there is a part of you that's like that. But I think I've been creating for long enough to know that you need to create in a format or a style that's going to work best with the type of person that you are. You need to at least take a little bit of what you are, take a little bit of what you've been given and the type of person that you are, and work that into the format that you're trying to create in. That's kind of the point that I'm trying to get at today. But something like this podcast, for example, it's very, very, very easy for me to sit here for 45 minutes to an hour once a week and create a cohesive piece of content. And because it's very easily for me to be consistent, it's effortless for me to be consistent. It's part of my week. I don't question whether I'm going to do it. It takes me about 20 minutes to set up the episode and figure out what I want to talk about. It takes me, I don't have to double take. I don't have to edit at all. It pretty much from start to finish, it takes me about 2.5 hours to do this podcast. So because that's such a small effort for me to be consistent, it's 2.5 hours of my week with very low interruption. It's not very physically draining. It's not very emotionally draining because I find this style of content very easy to do. I can start to focus on things like getting better. I can start to focus on things like my content. I can start to focus on things like my promotional element. I can start to focus on the design of this podcast. I can start to focus on how I can share it more often, how I can cut it down into smaller clips, how I can do things to get this podcast heard by more people, because the consistency side of it is kind of covered. That's taken care of. Now imagine if I was to take my friends that I was talking about who have become very successful on TikTok, the type of people that are loud, witty, funny, they're the type of people that are naturally inclined to that style of content. Imagine if I was to take one of them and tell them to be consistent on a podcast for however long until they're able to be successful. It would be pretty much just as difficult for me to make comedy sketches 3, 4, however many times a day it's required to be successful on TikTok. It would be just as hard for them to make content on a podcast as it would be for me to make content on TikTok. And I'm not kind of comparing, it's comparing tomatoes to apples as far as like the style of content and the duration and all that sort of stuff. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about purely how difficult it is for me to produce that style of content as opposed to them producing my style of content. And the downside of that, and what the point I'm trying to get at here, is that whilst I'm not concerned about consistency, and whilst I'm able to use that energy to promote it, to create better design, to create better content, to spend more time in pre-production rather than production, to make sure my camera and my lighting is good and things look good, to make sure all my thumbnails in order, all the descriptions, I'm sharing the podcast on as many platforms as possible. Whilst I'm using my extra energy to do that, they're using that same amount of energy just to be consistent. And that is the point that I'm trying to get at today. I think that there's the antagonist to this argument. The argument that I'm trying to get at today is I think that you need to focus primarily on leveraging the audience or leveraging the audience. I got too excited. I'm getting too amped up. But I think that you need to focus primarily on leveraging the skills and the type of person that you already are. Rather than worrying primarily about, what's the most lucrative way for me to create my art? What's the most desirable way for me to create my art? Focus on what's the easiest way for you to create your art. Because I think that something that a lot of people forget is that the amount of consistency that's required to simply become successful kind of eliminates the hard work principle. Yes, there is the element of hard work, but I think that you can only work so hard. You only have so many willpower points per week. And I think this comes back to this argument. I've spoken about this before, but if you have 100 willpower points for your week, let's say, for example, That's an easy argument to use. If I have 100 willpower points for a week and I'm wasting, or say, for example, if this podcast, and I have two people, my friend John and me. And for me, it takes me 10 willpower points to be consistent on my podcast, and it takes John 40 willpower points to be consistent on his podcast. That means I have 90 willpower points left for everything else that I have to do in the week, whilst John has 40 willpower points to be consistent throughout the week. Sorry, my brain couldn't concentrate on. Quite clearly, I'm supposed to be an artist. I was trying to concentrate on math and my conversation at the same time. But what I'm trying to get at here is that focus on what comes easiest to you. Focus on the type of content that you find most effortless to produce, the way in which, or the format in which you can create that lends itself best to your personality. John might be a YouTuber. Maybe it takes 15 willpower points for John to create a YouTube video. It's very easy for him to create a YouTube video, so he can focus on creating more content, being more consistent, creating better content, creating better images, better thumbnails, better descriptions, getting his video seen. Whereas for me, it might take 50, 60 willpower points alone just to create the video. Does that make sense? It's kind of like forcing yourself into, yes, you might be a creative person. You might even be a filmmaker. But if it's something that doesn't come naturally to you to get on camera once a week and talk about a topic that's maybe a little bit educational or something like that, then there's no point in forcing yourself into a mold where you're not even going to be able to build up the consistency enough to be successful. Again, I'm not trying to tell you not to try. I'm not trying to tell you not to try at all. The reason why I bring this up and the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because it's become a popular mentality these days amongst social media gurus or experts. It's kind of a popular thing that you need to have a crack at every platform. The idea behind it is that if you have a podcast, for example, you should be cutting that podcast down and distributing it across all of the different platforms, or you should be creating short form content on TikTok. You should be creating long form on YouTube, long form on Facebook, short form on LinkedIn. You should be creating blog posts on your website. You should be creating articles on LinkedIn. You should be creating a whole bunch of different things for all the different platforms so you can touch base with your audience as many different ways as possible. You should be giving your audience as many different opportunities to connect with you per week as possible. That's the mentality behind it. Now, my issue with it here is that I don't think it lends itself well to creators. I think it's a mentality that works for a business. I think if you're a business and you're trying to build an audience or you're trying to sell something, then yes, you want to be on as many different platforms as possible. You want to give yourself every opportunity to create. But when you're a creative person who has a genuine talent, and yes, that is a stab at social media gurus. When you're a creative who has a genuine talent, I think that your energy that you can spend creating brilliant work is far better used than using that energy to spread yourself thin across multiple platforms. I think there's definitely a benefit to creating across multiple platforms. I think there is. I create across multiple platforms. I cut this podcast down and I post it on LinkedIn and Facebook. That's my only use for Facebook. But I'm saying that there's no point in me creating specific content just for Facebook. There's no point in me creating articles for LinkedIn because that's not utilizing what I'm talented at. That's not utilizing what I already have the skills to do. The reason for this is, and the reason why I think this is important for creatives, it was brought up in The War of Art. And I don't have the book here because I lent it to a friend, so I can't recite the actual page. But in The War of Art, he talks about the difference between hierarchies and territories. When you're a creative person, there's two sort of ways that you can think of the world and live your life. There's a hierarchical mentality, which is kind of the high school mentality. It's the idea that you're, the popular kid. The popular kid might be popular because of a number of reasons. Maybe they're a little bit smart, so they get along with this bunch of people. They're a really good athlete, so they get along here. And they're a little bit of a teacher's pet, so they get along with the teachers. And as a general sense, they're at the top of the hierarchy. Whereas someone who is specific, maybe an athlete at a school, and this, ignore the jock and all that sort of stuff. Let's say a kid who's good at chess. Let's say a kid who is exceptional at chess. In the hierarchical mentality, in the high school mentality of having a hierarchy, that kid's not going to do too well. He's not going to be one of the popular kids, or in the traditional or stereotypical sense of high schools. He's not going to be one of the popular kids, but he might be a chess grandmaster in his realm. For his age, he's at the top of his territory. Does that make sense? That's kind of the underlying idea, and the reason why I brought this up is because I think that you should be primarily focusing as an artist on dominating your territory. A good comparison that I saw in the book, and if anyone owns The War of Art, go to page 154 is where this is written down, but it compares Bill Gates and Arnold Schwarzenegger. If you have Arnold, his territory is the gym. And if you have Bill Gates, his territory is IT or tech or Microsoft. If you put Arnold Schwarzenegger in Microsoft, he's going to struggle. If you put Bill Gates in the gym, he's going to struggle. Each of them are at the top of their territory and incredibly successful at the top of their territories. But each of them, as far as a hierarchy, aren't even on the same page. Does that make sense? It's kind of the difference between being, if I was the worst painter in the world, but the best writer, I'm still an incredible artist. Does that make sense? If my hierarchy is artists, or my territory is painting versus writing, we can be both artists, but you can be the best painter in the world and the worst writer, and I can be the best writer but the worst painter in the world. And we're still both incredible artists. And that's the benefit to working in a territory mindset rather than a hierarchical mindset, because you can focus primarily on what your skills and your talents lend themselves best to. You can focus on creating in a style that works best for you rather than worrying about anyone else. And I think that that's kind of the benefit that this has given me, is because I've been so concerned about, how can I create for YouTube? How can I make my personality work for YouTube? How can I, make personal development content rather than making tutorial content because I don't enjoy tutorial content? Or how can I do this instead of doing that? How can I do whatever? Whereas something like Instagram, for example, I find it very, very easy for me to sit down and edit photos. I find it very easy for me to take photos because I enjoy that. And the reason for that is because that's something that lends itself well to my personality. I'm naturally quite an introvert, so me sitting here and editing photos all day whilst it's sunny outside is something I find extremely easy. Whereas if I take, for example, something like live streaming, I find it incredibly difficult because I don't know how to be that bubbly and entertaining for that long. Something like the podcast is very easy for me because it's just me. It's just me talking to a microphone in front of camera. There's no pressure. There's no one watching. In my mind, I know that you're all listening to this right now, but that's not a connection that I'm making right now. Does that, as weird as that sounds, I know that you're listening to this right now, but I've said this before. Whilst I'm recording these episodes, yes, I'm talking to you and I have this idea of my audience. I have this visualization of the type of person who listens to this podcast, what they might want to hear. But at the end of the day, I'm sitting in front of a microphone, in front of a camera with headphones on, listening to my own voice and staring at a monitor with my own face on it. This is, in every sense of the word, personal time. This is me just talking to myself. And the reason why I know that lends itself well to me is because I talk to myself a lot. In my own life, and this is weird, and I've spoken about this before, but I talk to myself a lot. I have a very, very loud internal dialogue. I'm constantly creating and visualizing and playing out scenarios in my head where it's just something that I've always had. I've always had a very loud internal dialogue. I've always had very clear visualizations. It's always been something, I think that's why I have always been creative as a kid. My earliest memories of being a creative is having the ability to visualize something before it was on paper. Having the ability to literally see the proportions of a human body on a piece of paper before I had drawn it out. It was almost like tracing for me when I was younger. And this sounds extreme, this sounds weird, But let me know if you're a creative person and you have something similar. It's like you have the ability to you have a very, very clear and detailed ability to visualize. You have almost not an eidetic memory, because that's completely different, but you have this way of creating something in your own mind before it's created physically, which allows you to almost feel like you're tracing when you're drawing, or almost following like a manual when you're editing a photo or making a video. You have this kind of very easy way of describing. I think that my loud internal dialogue is kind of like a cheat code for my podcasting. I am almost able to think of something as I'm saying something and then follow my words as I'm going. At no point in this podcast do I sit down and go, where did that idea come from? Because I honestly don't know. The way I speak in these podcasts, I know what I'm about to say, but I never understand it's almost like I'm ahead of myself the entire time. And because I'm ahead of myself, I never feel like I'm lost for something to say. Does that make sense? It is something that I feel like I've had my entire life. And that's kind of the general thing that I'm trying to encourage each of you to do, is figure out where those parts of you lie for you. What parts of you, where is your loud internal dialogue? Were you the kind of kid who, when they were younger, was able to visualize something on a piece of paper before they drew it? Are you the type of kid whose math equations solve themselves in front of your eyes? It's, I love the idea. It's like people who can code. I cannot code, and I've tried. I've tried learning code. I've tried learning UI and UX and front-end design for websites. I've tried this. I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday who's very talented at this sort of stuff. And he was like, oh, why don't you just, use YouTube or buy a course or something? And I'm like, I've tried. My brain doesn't work for that style of creating. And I think for him, that is something that works really, really well with his set of skills that he was given originally, that he was predisposed with, lend themselves well to creating or front-end development of a website. I think the overall point that I want to hit for this, and the reason why I kind of wanted to talk about this topic in particular, is I was journaling earlier this week and I came up with, I sort of realized whilst I was journaling that, and I highly recommend this for anyone, because this is kind of how I come up with the ideas for this podcast, is I sit down once a week on a Sunday and I journal about the week, and it kind of dumps things, it kind of gets everything out of my mind that I otherwise wouldn't really speak about or wouldn't really flesh out and figure out. And one of the things that I noticed this week is that I think that I'm really enjoying this podcast. And I'm really enjoying all the other parts of this podcast now. I spent a lot of time, if you guys have noticed, on the design of my podcast. I've been playing around with a few new things as far as how I want to share the episodes on Instagram, how I want to share the episodes on LinkedIn. I've been testing how much of a benefit I gain from sharing on one platform as opposed to another. I've been testing how I can do certain things on here and how it impacts my audio listeners versus how it impacts my visual listeners. I'm focusing on making the podcast look awesome for YouTube. And the thing that I wrote down that kind of hit me, and the reason why I wanted to make this episode, is that none of those things would be possible unless I was consistent. And that kind of gave me a revelation. It made me realize that consistency is the key, and it's the overall key. It's the one thing that you should primarily focus on. Because once you tackle consistency, the rest falls into place. Everything that I've spoken about today is simply a goal of achieving consistency, because you cannot achieve consistency unless you enjoy something. You cannot get to consistency unless you're playing to your strengths. You cannot force yourself to be consistent. I think that this is kind of the key thing to, talent. Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. I think that, that comes down to the consistency element. It comes down to how often are you showing up? I wouldn't be able to worry about how many listeners I'm getting on the audio versus visual if I wasn't making the podcast in the first place. I wouldn't be able to worry about the design of my Instagram posts and the design of the intros and outros of my episodes if I wasn't being consistent in the first place. I wouldn't be able to focus on creating better content and focusing on the pre-production of my episodes if I wasn't being consistent in the first place. But this also shows me that, yeah, I could force myself to make a YouTube video this week. I could very easily force myself and just go, all right, Tom, your number one priority this week is above everything else. No matter what happens, you're going to post a YouTube video. But what good is that going to give me if I don't show up the next week? Or if I, like I spoke about earlier, if I spend way too many points, spend way too many of my, and I've completely forgot, willpower points, spend way too many of my willpower points on the episode to the point where I'm not able to be consistent. And that's kind of given me this revelation that you can't force consistency. You can't force consistency because all you're going to end up doing is burning out. But the key to success is consistency. So by mastering consistency, you're inevitably going to get better. Inevitably going to get better. So I think that once you pair the thing that you're naturally talented with your natural inclinations or your natural personality, then you end up in the perfect moment. Then you end up in a position where you're able to completely eliminate the need to worry about consistency because you're just focusing on getting better. If I know I'm going to show up every single week, then I can start to plan for things that don't matter unless I'm being consistent. It unlocks a whole new world of how can I make better episodes? How can I get better thumbnails? How can I take better design? Should I be taking photos for my Instagram rather than just posting videos? Should I be promoting it on different platforms? Should I be reaching out to brands yet? None of that would matter unless I had the consistency part of it down pat. And I think that that's kind of something I think a lot of artists don't pay attention to, sometimes for the sake of because they don't need to. I think it's something that's usually handled. If you're enjoying what you're doing, this is not something you think about. This is not something you worry about. But I think that this is kind of the general thing that I'm trying to tell you is that make consistency your goal. Make that the thing that you're chasing. Make that the thing that you're Make that the thing that you're trying to achieve. Make that your number one priority, because once that's taken care of, everything else will fall into place. Obviously, there's the examples where, it's it's not just enough to be consistent. In my own life, for example, like I said, I'm the type of person that had the ability to visualize. I am the type of person that from a very, very young age, I had this ability to visualize something before it was on a piece of paper. My earliest memories of creating were looking at a piece of paper and having something materialize in front of me to the point where it almost felt like I was tracing the paper. So for me, creating was not only something that I found very easy and enjoyable, but it was something that I was naturally inclined to do. Numbers, on the other hand, do not work. My brain does not work with numbers. That's not something that I've ever been able to do, nor is it something that I ever think I will be able to do. I'm sure I could get better at it, but it's not something that I am naturally inclined to do. I have an unfair advantage when it comes to drawing because I am literally able to visualize the proportions of a human body and feel like I'm tracing rather than drawing, as opposed to numbers where I know people who's probably look at a page of numbers and have the equations materialize before their eyes. I don't have that. I can see something before I create it. When I'm editing a photo or editing a video, I can almost clear as day see the finished product before I create the finished product. And it's the same thing with this podcast. The thing that I find easiest about this podcast is the fact that I have the ability to think ahead. I'm not worried about what I'm saying now because I've already visualized what I'm about to say. It's almost like my internal dialogue, the loud internal dialogue that I spoke about that gives me the advantage and makes me naturally inclined to do this is almost like a cheat code for podcasting because I'm already talking to myself. Does that make sense? It's weird, but it is almost like a cheat code for podcasting. And that's what I'm going to tell you is that figure out where your natural inclinations lie, figure out where your natural talents lie, and then use those to be consistent. Because once you've got consistency down pat, once you make consistency as effortless for you as possible, then success doesn't become something that's a potential. Success becomes something that's a when. How long is it going to take until something works? How long is it going to take until I get good enough that I can find some success? Because I strongly believe that consistency is the key to success as a creative person. Some people achieve it younger, some people achieve it quicker. But over time, if you're consistent, you're going to achieve something eventually. As I always say, it's all very well and good for me to, talk about this sort of stuff and and tell you the ideas that I have in my own mind, but I want to give you guys some advice that has kind of I jotted down a couple things before I started recording this podcast that I think will help give you an idea of where those natural talents lie, or at least help give you an idea of where you should be spending your time. How you should start to discover where those natural inclinations can be used. How can you find your loud internal dialogue, or how can you find your, whatever it is, the talent that you have that's going to help predispose you for something else. The first piece of advice that I wanted to give is combine interests and passions. I've spoken about this on the podcast before. I think I spoke about it ages ago. It would have been the first 10 episodes. But, something that I realized when starting my creative business is that you can love filmmaking all you want, but if you end up making films on something you don't enjoy, then that passion's as good as nothing. That passion's not going to help you if you're making things you're not passionate about. So I don't think it's good enough to just find one thing that you're passionate about. I think you need to combine it with something that you enjoy doing. For example, a few ones that I've used is I love travel and I love photography. So there's definitely the potential there for me to make money, or at least have a portion of my business be dedicated to travel photography. I love painting and I love photography. So for me, digital art is something that I find a huge amount of fulfillment in. I love photography, and I love when I capture an image and I get to look at that image and go, that stands on its own. I don't need to do anything to this image. I actually really, really enjoy that part, and it's something that I'm trying to develop more of. But when I find the most fulfillment in a piece of artwork, when I enjoy this creative outlet to the maximum, when I'm finding the most enjoyment out of it, is when I'm combining that painting style of creativity with photography. When I'm creating digital art, that's when I find the most enjoyment. And the last one is sport and photography, or sport and filmmaking. For me, a lot of my business is orientated around the sport and fitness industry. And the reason for that is I have a lot of passion and I really enjoy sport and fitness. I love doing a lot of the sports that I shoot. I shoot rowing, I shoot boxing, I shoot rugby, I shoot a lot of these sports that I'm already enjoying doing, or I already enjoy watching. So by creating for it, it's just, it's an extra way of me enjoying these things. If I was to take my filmmaking business and focus on real estate, I'd probably hate my job because I don't enjoy real estate. I don't enjoy architecture. I don't enjoy any element of real estate. So there's no part of that, even if it was high-end, even if I was being paid heaps of money to do it, there's no part of that I would find enough enjoyment in to be consistent over time. So I think the first piece of advice that you can take is combine your interests, or figure out where you have multiple passions. Figure out how you can sort of combine two things at once. The second is the I Am Legend test. And I don't know if I heard this. I think I heard a version of this, but I like the idea of labeling it the I Am Legend test. I think I heard it on a, where did I read it? Anyway, I think I have read this somewhere, but I don't think I've ever heard it being called the I Am Legend test. So I like that. If anyone knows and I'm pulling this out of thin air, or if I am actually just ripping it off from someone else and I'm not aware that I'm ripping it off, kind of like that. What's there's a medical term for it, I think. It's like when you're copying without the knowledge of copying. I can't remember what it was, but let me know if I am, or let me know if I have actually just come up with this on the spot. But the I Am Legend test is, would you still do this if you were the last person on Earth? If you were the last person on Earth, would you still do what your creative business is or what you spend your time trying to achieve. Would you still make YouTube videos if you were the last person on earth? And I know this takes very special considerations, because I think that there's certainly parts of all of our businesses that require us to do things that we don't necessarily enjoy. I think a good way of describing this is, Arnold again. If we take Arnold Schwarzenegger, if he was the last person on earth, I'm sure he would still go to the gym and lift weights every single day, regardless of the fact that he's the last person on earth. Now, that doesn't mean that he would do it as much. I'm sure there's definitely days, or back when he was at his prime, I'm sure there were definitely days where he didn't feel like doing it. I'm sure there were definitely points where he didn't feel like dieting as much. I'm sure he wouldn't get stage ready if he was the last person on earth. I'm sure he wouldn't do it to the extreme, but I'm sure he would do it every single day. If Billie Eilish was the last person on earth, I'm sure she wouldn't put together albums and force herself to do all the different things that are required to have a successful music career, but I'm sure she would still play music and sing and write songs and do all the things that built the foundation of what she's doing. And I think that that's where this test can lend itself well. No, you wouldn't necessarily make YouTube videos if you were the last person on earth, but you would like to hope that you'd still film stuff. If you find yourself not enjoying what you're doing, use this test. I might not necessarily make podcasts, but I'd probably still talk to myself. I'd probably still write. I'd probably still deliberate over these ideas. I'd probably still journal. I'd probably still do a lot of the things that are required that go into an episode. I might not sit down formally and record, because there's no point. I do this because there is an audience to listen to it, but I think I would still do a lot of the things that are required for it. I would certainly still do photography if I was the last person on earth. I would still paint if I was the last person on earth. I'd still draw if I was the last person on earth. And that's why this question has come up, because I don't know if I'd still, I think I'd still film stuff. I don't know if I'd still talk to camera. There's certainly a benefit to doing this test, and it can help you figure out where you might be, where you can spend most of your time. I think that's the benefit to this. How can you build the strongest foundation? What are you most inclined to do? What do you find the most enjoyment in? Because you're not going to do something if you were the last person on earth unless you were enjoying the process. And I think that's how you can use this test. The third one I definitely got from The War of Art. I think I did. And this one's, do you find it easy to do what others find difficult? What's something that you find really, really easy, but others find difficult to do? If you're a creative person, it might be coming up with creative ideas. One of the things that a lot of creative people have is, yes, you might have a talent to use a camera. Yes, you might have the ability to draw or the ability to paint or the technical skills. But one of the things that differentiates you from non-creative people is the ability to come up with ideas. I can sit here and teach someone how to use a camera, and they're probably going to get pretty bloody good at using a camera. If I gave them a subject matter to shoot and planned everything out and showed them how to use the lighting and did everything for them, I'm sure they would take a bloody good photo. But the difference between me and them is that I still came up with the idea. And that's why you're creative. It's like the creative test that they talk about in, what book was it? There's a creative test where it's like you give someone an object, or you tell someone an object, and you see how many different ways they come up, how many different ideas they come up with as far as ways to use that object, and how abstract those ideas are. And the more ideas and the more abstract the ideas are, then the more creative that person is. It's like, for example, let's say a brick. If you give a brick to a non-creative person, they'll say build a house, maybe a paperweight, and that's it. Whereas you give if you give a brick to a creative person, they'll come up with a list of, a sculpture. They'll come up with a list of it can be used to hit someone. It can be used for X, Y, Z. It'll be used to do a whole bunch of different, very abstract things. And the more things they come up with, then the more creative that person is. And that's the difference between you and a non-creative person. And that's something that you find easier than a non-creative person. So where in your life are you capable of doing things that others find difficult? Let's bring it back to my friend who's a designer, or he's not a designer, he's a filmmaker, but he finds it he enjoys UI, UX, and front-end design of his website. He really enjoys that, and he does it kind of freelance semi for other people because he enjoys it so much. That's something that he is naturally inclined to do, whereas I find it borderline impossible. I find it very, very difficult to wrap my head around UI, UX, and front-end design for a website. I find it really, really difficult to comprehend. I'm a creative person. I enjoy design. I do a lot of my own design work. I can't figure out how to make a website. So that's kind of something that you can compare. If I were to take me, for example, it comes back to this podcast example. I find it very, very easy, borderline effortless for me to sit down once a week on a Sunday and record for 45 minutes to an hour. That is something that I know for a fact that a lot of people find difficult. It stops a lot of people from starting a podcast because the number one question I get asked is, how do you have enough to talk about? That's not even a consideration in my mind because I know that even if I don't have stuff to talk about, I'm going to figure out a way to talk for that long. Because I have a very loud internal dialogue. I just have an ability to talk. I find it very easy to sit here and talk for 45 minutes to an hour. That is something that I find easy that others find difficult. But it's also something that I have a level of talent at. It's something that I at least have enough talent that I could find a way to make it successful. Let's take another part of my life is I love training. I love fitness. I love it enough that I find it very easy for me to be consistent. But one of the things that I discovered very, very early on is that even at my absolute most disciplined, I had the best program, I was training consistently, I was lifting heavy weights as often as I can, and I had a strict diet of a very, very high amount of calories. I was consistently putting on weight every single week. Even with all of the right things put in place, my numbers as far as the weights that I could lift at the time, and this is me trying to do powerlifting when I was like 18 or 19 at the time, my numbers, even in those very strict and disciplined times during my life where I was most focused on that one thing, even under those circumstances, I was still pretty average for my height and weight. And it's just something that I have discovered that I am not athletically talented. Even if I am consistent and even if I love what I'm doing, it's not something that I find easy. I find it difficult for me to get stronger. I don't find it easy for me to get stronger. Even when I'm so disciplined, even when I'm consistent, even though I love it, it's not something that I find easy. Whereas I have a friend who can blow on his thumb and get stronger. He's the type of person that you could put him in an empty room and get him to train bodyweight exercises and give me the best gym with the best nutritionist in the world. He's still going to be stronger than me at the end of a 6-week training program. It's just the way it is. He finds it really easy to get stronger. I find it really difficult. So step number 3 is try to find parts of your life where you find things easy, or what do you find easy whilst others find difficult? And I got this from the War of Art. I think I did. The fourth piece of advice is the Goldilocks Rule. And I got this one from Atomic Habits. And this is the idea that there's a sweet spot for creativity, or a sweet spot for action. Not for creativity. There's a sweet spot for action. And it's pretty self-explanatory. If any of you have read Goldilocks, it's the not too hot, not too cold. The perfect zone for action is just outside of your comfort zone or just outside of your ability. If I was to make a video, for example, and this is something that I've been deliberating a lot in my own mind, is am I making it too difficult? Am I setting the bar? How am I setting the bar for me to create a YouTube video too high for me to actually create one? Is it too difficult for me to take that action? If I was to apply the Goldilocks Rule, and this is something that you can start to apply to your own actions, is there may be a very good chance that you're just making it too difficult for yourself right now to be consistent. If I apply the Goldilocks Rule to my YouTube channel, I need to make my videos easier for me to create. I need to make it a simpler process. I need to make it more like my podcast, where it takes me 20 to 30 minutes to plan, it takes me an hour to record, and it takes me 2 hours maximum to edit. That is the perfect example of the Goldilocks Rule, but the Goldilocks Rule can also keep you moving forward in the future. Because eventually this is going to become too easy and it's not going to interest me as much. There is a point where, that perfect point where it's just challenging enough to hold your attention, but not too easy that you lose interest, but also not too difficult that you get disgruntled or you get discouraged from doing it. If something's too difficult, you're not going to be able to be consistent because it's going to be discouraging every single time you try to do it because you're going to be constantly coming up against roadblocks. Whereas if something's too easy, it's not going to hold your interest. It needs to be that perfect zone of just outside of your comfort zone. Just outside of it enough that it interests you and keeps you motivated to do it because you're solving problems, but also easy enough that you can actually do it and actually accomplish your goals. I think we've gone pretty long today. I don't know how long this episode's gone for because I haven't been timing. I forgot to turn my timer on at the start, but I enjoyed this. I hope it was at least somewhat cohesive. I think the underlying thing that I want to leave you with now is the consistency thing. That's the whole reason that I wanted to make this podcast, is that I want you to focus primarily on consistency and not just on forcing yourself to be consistent. I mean, how can you make consistency as easy as possible? How can you kind of use how can you use less willpower points? How can you figure out a way to spend less willpower points on the consistency part of it? If you can get consistency locked in to the point where it's actually quite easy for you to be consistent, then you can focus on the things that actually matter, like getting better, creating better content, getting better design, spending more money on skilling up in certain areas or figuring out new skills that are going to help you get your project seen by the people. There's a whole bunch of things that you can focus on once consistency is tackled. So how can you focus on making consistency as easy as possible? Spend less willpower points on consistency and apply the Goldilocks Rule. Make it easier for yourself. Try to figure out a way that makes what you're currently doing easier for you. I loved I think it was Bill Gates who said, he's always going to hire a lazy person because a lazy person is going to figure out an easy way to do a difficult project because they want to spend less time doing it, or they want to spend less energy doing it. So try to implement a little bit of a lazy person mentality into your work because it's going to make it easier for you to do the things that are going to be required to be successful. I hope it's been consistent. I hope it's been cohesive. I don't know if it has been, but I say that every week, and every single week I listen to the podcast and it is cohesive. So I'm going to trust my own intuition with this one and trust that I did say something that was at least a little bit consistent. As I say every week, and as I started with this week, the number one thing that you can do to support me and to support this podcast, if you have been enjoying it, is to share it with a friend. Share it with someone you think may appreciate it. Share it with someone you think might get something from it, or share it with someone who just, has an extra hour every single week that you want them to burn on a Monday. I'm kidding. You're not burning your time. We can call this education, right? We can call this useful to some degree, or we can all just kind of pretend to ourselves so we can spend time enjoying it. But yeah, I hope you have enjoyed this episode. I hope you have. I genuinely do hope you have, because I enjoyed making it. So with all that said and done, as I always say, I'm not your dad. You don't have to do anything I tell you to do, and I'll speak to you guys next week.